Hello, welcome to another gun game devlog. If you're new to this devlog series, Gun Game is a game that I'm developing in Godot with C# that's about crafting your guns. The main mechanic, though, is that you have two guns at all times that are each controlled by a mouse button, either the left or the right mouse button. Your two guns share an ammo pool, so you have to rapidly swap between which guns you're firing in order to maintain your ammo. This game will be wrapped in an action roguelike wrapper where you can get randomized loot, different events, and all of that good stuff. The last devlog I covered dungeon generation. If you haven't seen that, there's a link in the description below. You can check it out if you like. And to get into the gameplay changes that I've made outside of dungeon generation, let's start with drag and drop gun crafting. So before, in an earlier version of the game, the way that you would swap your gun parts is simply by clicking them in the inventory. But now, when you click an item, it sort of attaches to your cursor, and then you can select which slot you want it to go into. So if I wanted to put it on weapon 1, I can target weapon 1, and for weapon 2, I can target weapon 2. I also enabled the ability to swap parts between the guns you have equipped. So right off the bat, if you have nothing in your inventory, you can swap the barrels if you want to, you can swap the magazines, you can swap the receivers, you can swap anything between those two guns. Along with this, I added tooltip descriptions for the gun parts so that you can get some insight into what each part does and what the stats are. It's in a rough spot right now, but it works. I just needed the information for now, and I will be looking at refining this and making it prettier in the future. On the art front, I use the dungeon tile set as my default tile set. So in earlier videos, you may have seen sort of a green tile set. That was supposed to be something like a malachite forest, but that takes a lot of effort to get right, and I wasn't happy with how it looked. So I went with something that's much simpler to do, which is a dungeon. I added some variants to the tile set, and that's what you're seeing in front of you. I have plans to add more environmental items to make rooms that look more interesting, you know, adding clutter, adding rugs and all that stuff, but this is a good foundation to work on and I'm happy with how it turned out, so this is what I'm using for now. So inside the dungeon, the enemies have had their AI improved. Before, the enemies would get stuck on things and they kind of behaved weirdly, they would jitter around all the time, so I tweaked that, fixed it up. The enemy AI is now a lot smoother, they're less likely to get stuck on things. They still get stuck inside of walls, but that's a separate issue. And they will maintain a certain distance from you and strafe around you in a certain radius. And this just adds a lot of variance. It gives the player a moving target that's kind of hard to hit. And so that's going to add a little bit of variety. Along with that, I also changed the fire rate of the enemies. So before, they were just on a flat 2-second timer, and now they can fire anywhere between 1.5 and 2.5 seconds, and this just sort of breaks up that monotony of the fire rate that they had before, and makes the gameplay a little bit more interesting. For main bosses, I am very much intending to make their attack patterns very predictable, because obviously people get frustrated when bosses are unpredictable and you can't learn how to beat them. Okay, and you'll notice too in this gameplay that I created a cursor that plays a little animation when you're firing. That's just something nice to have and makes the game look a little bit more polished. And then when I open up the inventory, you can see that it switches to a pointer style cursor for inventory management. I just figured that would be easier than something like a crosshair for managing your inventory. You can see on the ground here, I have made the loot drops prettier visually. So I added a shadow underneath them to make them sort of look like they're floating. And then I also added this little flash animation that goes around the exterior of the item. And that's just kind of an extra visual indicator that, hey, this is something that you want to pay attention to, don't ignore me, you know, all of that good stuff. And speaking of loot, I added new gun parts as a set. So there is now a Moss weapon. It has, you know, the standard 3 parts, the receiver, the magazine, and the barrel. And the interesting thing about the Moss weapon is that it shoots these green projectiles that have a trail that sort of looks like poison. The idea is that there will be different damage types in the game. I haven't figured out exactly how that works out, but I think thematically this was really fun, and I needed more guns rather to put into the game. so I can get a better feel of what it's like to have a variety of loot in the game. Related to the bullets, the moss bullets that I just talked about, is the fact that I switched to using particles for everything. So the trails that you're seeing are particles for the moss bullet, but also when bullets collide with terrain or they, expire or whatever, that's all being done now with particles. I was using sprites before for some of it, but I found particles were easier for me to implement, and also I could make them look kind of like sprites by just limiting the FPS that the particle system plays at. So I set all of these to 20 FPS, made a general shape of how I want the impact to look, added the colors, and it works out really nicely. So you can see when I hit the wall with a moss bullet, you can see that those little bursts that happen, those are all particles. When an enemy bullet hits the wall, same deal, those are particles, and then also the same for the standard bullet. And finally, for the gameplay changes that I've made, is now you can do a miniature run. So I implemented these, what I call gateways, and these are essentially breaks in the dungeon wall that have a flame wall in front of them. And if you go through the flame wall, you are then put into the next level of the run. This was very tricky to get done because if you watch my dungeon generation video, you know that I have data that represents all of the rooms. What I had to do though was I had to determine all of the dungeon walls that were not obscured by anything, right? So I had to find the walls of each room that didn't have a hallway connecting to them. And the reason I needed to do that was so that I could determine where to place the gateways. It was a little tricky, took a lot of time, but I finally have a solution that works really well. And so the gateways will be placed randomly. I mentioned earlier that I have like a miniature game loop going on now. You can go through this gateway, enter a level, you can clear 2 levels, and then when you enter the final gateway, you're put back into the main room that you start in before you even started the run. So that's more of a proof of concept to say, okay, here is how the general flow is going to go, and when I end, I get put back. And so for a demo purpose, if I wanted to send the demo to somebody, or if I wanted to have it available publicly for people to play, it's just at least, a continuous loop rather than, like a hard stop or players would hit a wall sometime. Another little bit on the gateways real quick is I'm planning to have more than one exit in every level. So you'll know that a game called Hades does this really well. It's one of the best received, best reviewed roguelikes of recent times, and that game is really good about providing the players with multiple choices for how they proceed forward. And there's a lot of other games that do this as well, but I'm going to implement it that way. I'm thinking about borrowing ideas from Path of Exile's Labyrinth system. So if you're familiar with that game, when you're going through something called the Labyrinth, the pathway is revealed to you as you go on, and there's usually multiple pathways that are valid that you can go through to the exit. So that's something that I want to do in this game, and I'm thinking about how to implement that. I'm thinking about how to make that interesting, but I will keep you all up to date on where that lands. So that's basically a quick summary of all of the gameplay changes I made. I've done a lot of other behind the scenes work that's not too exciting to show in the video, but that's all for today. I'll see you in the next devlog. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. Consider supporting my work by purchasing Swordslinger on Steam, link in the description.